On this episode of New Mexico Now, the state budget crisis escalates. We discuss the New Mexico economy, and we will talk border business along with border security. This is New Mexico Now. Welcome to New Mexico Now. I'm Anthony Moreno. Joining us in studio is Walt Rubel, editorial page editor with the Las Cruces Sun-News, and Lauren Villagran with the Albuquerque Journal. Thank you both for being with us. Let's get right to it. New Mexico's Democratic majority state legislature is suing Republican Governor Susana Martinez, saying that the governor violated the state constitution by vetoing funding for the legislature in higher education. The Albuquerque Journal recently reported that Governor Martinez recently told her cabinet to prepare a furlough plan for state employees. A Martinez spokesperson, Michael Lonergan, told the Journal that the conversation shouldn't even be happening. He says, quote, "The fact is lawmakers continue to stick their heads into the sand and ignore that we have a crisis before us." Democratic Senate Majority Leader Peter Wirth responded to the governor's actions to the Journal, criticizing the furlough plan by saying, quote, "It does seem like this is an effort to make the crisis bigger than it already is." Democratic lawmakers called the governor's furlough plan a political move, and as we tape this program Tuesday, there's been no announcement of a special session or agreement on the budget. Walt, I'd like to start off with you. Is this a political move or desperate times call for desperate measures?
Well, I think both of those things are probably true. There's no question that these are desperate times. The legislature, as you mentioned, has taken the governor to court. That is set to be heard on May 15th. Even if the court comes back with a ruling that day, that's only 90 days before the end of the fiscal year. So there is certainly desperation here all around. But in terms of, is this a political move? I think clearly it is, in that there is enough funding through this fiscal year, which once again comes up on July 1st as the end of the year. The governor was here in Las Cruces. Lauren and I both had a chance to talk to her at that press conference, and she was asked about her veto of higher education, and her answer was, well, the colleges and universities shouldn't worry about that because they have their funding for this fiscal year. So they're fine until July 1st, and we'll get everything worked out before then. Well, if that's true for the colleges and universities, why isn't it also true for the furloughs, for state employees? I asked her that when she was down here for the press conference, and her answer was that she was worried about the state's bond rating, which I think is a fair concern, but that's capital outlay projects. I mean, the state is at least a year away from borrowing money and putting out bonds for capital outlay projects. And so to say that would create a need to put in furloughs right now, I think clearly that would be a political move to ratchet up, I guess, the urgency so that there would, a deal would get done. But I think there is urgency already. I think all the governor needs to do is call everybody and they will come running and start negotiating, but I don't think she's made that call yet.
If I'm not mistaken, the colleges and universities have to turn their budgets in to the state in May. Is it either May 1st?
May 1st.
May 1st. So it's not just when the new fiscal year starts and that there's enough funding for that time. But I know here at NMSU, Chancellor Carruthers has made that point very clear that there needs to be, there's a planning process in place.
Yeah, and the regents have put off a proposed increase in tuition because they want to see what the state is going to do. I think when they made that decision, they were hopeful that it would be something short term and that they would know by now, but I think that puts them in a bind too, because clearly by the time they do pass anything, people will already have enrolled and you'll be changing the rates on them after they signed up.
I mean, you bring up enrollment. Chancellor Carruthers sent out an email to the university community recently saying that he was fairly confident that there would be a deal reached, but he was concerned about the 5 to 10% of the students who haven't enrolled yet because there isn't a budget deal in place and they're not sure how funding is going to be for the university.
Well, the regions were considering a range of tuition increases that I believe ranged from, was it around 1% all the way to 7%, a huge jump that I'm not sure that they would approve. But all of those increases still resulted in, will still result in cost-cutting measures and people likely losing their jobs. There is no good scenario, but for a student signing up for the fall, the difference between a 1% increase and a 7% increase could be the deciding factor. So we're all just sort of waiting.
I mean, we've seen universities nearby. Western New Mexico University has recently passed a tuition hike.
Yeah.
And so there's some movement. Some people aren't going to wait. Some people are they left planning for budgets in the dark?
Well, I understand the thinking of the regents, but I just think they were overly optimistic and they weren't reading the tea leaves right when it comes to this legislature and this governor. Anybody who's been watching them closely, the idea that they were going to solve that quickly, that was just not very likely to happen.
Well, right now we're looking at a court case in the Supreme Court, and we're weeks away from really having any type of answers with that. So I'm curious, Walt, is waiting a political strategy?
Well, here's the thing, even that doesn't resolve the issue. I mean, the governor has taken all the money away from the legislature. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to assume this whole 3 branches of government thing, you can't do that. You can't just take one branch and say, we're going to take all your money away. So I assume the court is going to find in favor of the legislature on that. Higher ed is in that case as well, and to me, once again, I'm not a lawyer, but my point is, even if that's the case, even if the court finds in favor of the legislature, that doesn't solve the problem. All that does is take away the veto of higher ed and the legislature, which now means that you have a budget that won't balance. Because the governor did veto the House Bill 202, which was the tax increases that made that balance. And that veto will stick. They would have to actually override that, and I don't think that's going to happen. So even if they win in court, they're still going to have to negotiate with the governor. They're still going to have to come to an agreement. And I just am not hearing from anybody that they've even started that process.
Well, let's talk about that process a little bit. How is that going along? Are people negotiating yet? Are they at the negotiating table, or are people hiding in the corners?
Well, when we spoke with the governor last week at her press conference, she indicated that she would be calling a special session within a few weeks, I believe, right, is what she said. She also said that what she wanted was a deal to be reached or very close to being reached before calling the special session, which I think costs $50,000 a day. However, at least one source has told me, and I believe Walt can back this up as well, that nobody's talking right now. So that preliminary deal does not seem to be in the works, at least from my angle.
Well, and it's not just right now. I mean, nobody has been talking, nobody meaning the legislature and the governor, from the beginning of the session. We just got a guest opinion from Senator Ortiz-Pino, and what he is alleging in his opinion piece is that throughout the session, members of the Senate were saying, will the governor agree to this? And well, we think so. The signals that we're getting from her lieutenant suggest that she's open to it. Well, that's what they were going along with this whole time. And so it's not surprising that they never had a meeting of the minds, because they never got together and tried to.
Well, we've seen action. There's been a lawsuit before the Supreme Court. The governor is traveling around the state, standing up for why she is standing up for vetoes. Right. So who's really making the best case right now, in your opinion? I mean, what do you think?
Well, you're right. The governor is going all around the state, and I assume it's the same show there as we got here. And it's the same thing that she said on the last day of the session. So there's nothing new. She's just taking that same speech to Hobbs and to Carlsbad, and maybe it's better received there than it was here. When she did it here, it was at the police headquarters, which is way out on the East Mesa, and there's nothing around it, so it's not like people would be walking by and see it. It was, as with everything with the governor, 15 minutes late, and it was just a small group of reporters standing out there. And so it wasn't in any way a public event, I guess is what I'm saying. Now, maybe in Hobbs and Carlsbad and friendlier places like that, maybe it was better received, maybe it was more public. But, what she got here, I think, was probably, critical newspaper coverage and critical TV coverage, because she was asked over and over again about this veto of higher education, and her answer just wasn't very reassuring.
I asked her point blank, was that politics? Was it a political move? Because why else do it? she seemed to suggest in her response that it was partly expediency, like I'm not going to go through and figure anything else out because I know it's going to be put back in once there's a special session. And while she does have her base of supporters who don't want any kind of tax increase, I think that at least everyone in this region that I've spoken with, when it comes up against funding our colleges and universities at the most basic level, I'm not sure that veto has much support. I haven't found anyone who has supported it yet, but I guess remains to be seen sort of how it plays out now.
Or understands it beyond just pure vengeance. I mean, why did she target higher education? Well, because the Senate didn't confirm her regents' appointments. It's not because she's mad at NMSU. It's not. She's not mad at Western or Eastern or any of these other schools that are being hurt. She was mad at the Senate. She was mad at Linda Lopez, the chair of the Rules Committee. And so because she's mad at Linda Lopez, she vetoed the whole higher education budget. I mean, I know that sounds petty, but that's what happened.
Now, the governor is not going to be able to run again. So she doesn't have much time left in office after this is all resolved or attempted to. So I'd like to talk a little bit about her legacy. We mentioned this last time. She's been firm about standing up against not raising taxes. Is that going to be her legacy, or is it going to be, not being able to work with the legislature to come up with a compromise?
Well, in my opinion, this veto changes everything. I mean, if she had, say, vetoed the whole budget and say, we're going to come back and start over. Or what she told Lauren was, I couldn't go through and pick and choose here and there. Why she couldn't do that, I'm not sure, but that's what she said. I think if the argument was only taxes, then she's got 45% of the people solidly behind her on her side. But once she pulls this crazy stunt, and I don't know what else to call it, of vetoing the entire higher education budget for the whole state, well, that 40% is now down to 10%, solidly behind her, and the rest kind of scratching their heads going, we agree with you on the taxes, but what are you doing?
Okay, we only have 50 more seconds on this topic, but who's the pressure on now? Is it more on the governor, or is it on the legislature to really come to compromise?
The governor has the veto pin. So, I mean, I think public opinion is moving against her, but at the end of the day, she has the veto pin.
Okay, let's move on. The Department of Labor released statistics that New Mexico has the highest unemployment rate in the entire country at 6.7%. The downturn in the oil and gas sectors has rocked the state's economy. Also, it appears that uncertainty in the industrial area in Santa Teresa near the U.S.-Mexico border is also causing some issues. I'd like to start off with just talking about the unemployment rate in general. I mean, we're looking at a loss of a number of jobs throughout the state, especially in education. If we're cutting higher education, I mean, how is this going to impact the future of not only recruiting education professionals, but jobs in general to the state?
That's a good point. I mean, there is some good news at NMSU that their freshman admissions were up this year. And so, at least potentially, but you wonder how much harm something like this can happen and how many of those kids will have second thoughts. So I think that's a good point, and we just have to wait and see. You have to hope it gets resolved soon.
And one of the other things is we hear from economic development professionals plenty about the need to have an educated workforce, a skilled workforce. If funding for higher education or even local public schools is up in the air right now, how is that going to impact recruiting companies to the state?
Well, I think here we have the dovetailing between sort of border security and the economics question. A couple of things. Down at Santa Teresa, which had been growing steadily, we'd seen exports rising. The effect of the Trump administration on border business development is significant. Business leaders down there tell me that it's sort of business as usual, except there's no additional capital investment. Even companies that are already located in Santa Teresa, most of whom supply the maquila assembly factories in Juarez and other parts of northern Mexico, even the companies that are already located there are holding pat on capital investments because nobody knows what's going to happen with the NAFTA renegotiation. Senator Tom Udall was down there touring a steel plant, and one of the things that got brought up was, if the NAFTA renegotiation is going to happen, there could be things that could be good for us in a renegotiation, but that process needs to start immediately because it will take a very long time. And then on the second part of your question with respect to recruiting people here, it's not just about education, but the rhetoric around border security, which we can speak a little bit more about in a bit, but the rhetoric around border security makes it very difficult to recruit businesses and executives and families here when someone living in Detroit or in Iowa or even in California might think, there's a war going on at the border. And of course, for our listeners and viewers here, that's not happening, right? But that rhetoric does have consequences.
Now, one of the biggest investors in that area was Union Pacific. What are their thoughts on, a possible renegotiation of NAFTA, or if it's perhaps scrapped?
Well, I mean, there was actually a Union Pacific representative who met with the senator last week, and their business has been booming. They have invested something like $2.5 billion, including the $500 million out at Santa Teresa, in recent years to upgrade their LA to El Paso or LA to Houston network. And what he said was specifically this: economic growth has been lackluster. It's just barely limping along. The reason why we made these investments is because trade with Mexico and trade with the rest of the world is growing. So all of their investments have been based on economic growth, trade-fueled economic growth. So if you throw a wrench in that system, they're concerned. They're concerned about that.
There was one small piece of good news. Senator Udall came to talk to the editorial board while he was down here. And I asked him about this border adjustment tax, which is thought to be a key part of the Republicans' plan for tax reform. It's basically the pay for, the way they find a way to offset all the tax cuts that they want to give out. And he suggested to me that Paul Ryan really didn't have support for that even in the House. I mean, he thought that at least was just not going to happen. Now, whether they come back with some other kind of tariff or some other kind of border tax, it's possible, but it seems like the pushback, especially from the retailers on that border adjustment tax, was really strong, and a strong Republican opposition to it. So that's a little bit of good news.
You've got two things on that point. One is that everything that crosses the border, when Mexico exports to the United States, the goods that it exports include, on average, 40% American-made content. So when you put a border adjustment tax or any kind of tariff that ultimately is going to fall back on American consumers and the American companies that are building things. One of the companies in Santa Teresa, Southwest Steel, went on the record to say, look, 97% or 90% of our business goes to Mexico. So we have no reason to be in New Mexico if that business model no longer works because of either tariffs or other trade negotiations.
The point he made was that they moved, I think, from Indiana.
Correct.
So yes, Indiana lost jobs, but they didn't lose those jobs to Mexico. They lost those jobs to Santa Teresa.
So if we do see something like NAFTA being renegotiated or scrapped, and a possible border tax or tariff, could New Mexico be hit the hardest out of the border states?
No, absolutely.
Senator Udall, that's exactly the way he put it. The thing is our economy, as everyone knows, is less diversified than perhaps Texas or California, so it's going to be a smaller impact in terms of the overall size compared with our much larger neighbors. But the idea of NAFTA being scrapped is almost unthinkable. There is, I believe the statistic is $500 billion worth of trade annually. It's pretty hard to think that everyone has something in their house that has been made between the US and Mexico, not just made in Mexico, but fashioned between the two countries. Ripping apart that integration is going to be very difficult.
Well, and imagine restarting that process. I mean, everybody's hopes and dreams for how they feel like they've been getting shafted all these years, and now we're going to make that all right with this new document and everybody's going to be happy with it?
I see. Well, we got to move on to the next topic, which is still dealing with the border. Attorney General Jeff Sessions and Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly recently toured the U.S.-Mexico border with a stop in El Paso. Lauren, you reported for the Journal on that stop that the Attorney General at the press conference called the borderlands a, quote, beachhead against the cartels. I'm curious, that type of language, how did it get a response from local leaders in El Paso?
Well, I think that local business leaders were sort of nothing short of horrified because they have spent an awful lot of time and money over the years to sort of promote that El Paso, the rankings of whether it's the safest city of its size have been called into question, but El Paso is a very safe city, like Las Cruces. There's just not the level of violence. I don't know how to describe the rhetoric. I mean, being a border resident of many years, I feel like the rest of the country might get a sense that we are being invaded by hordes of, gun-toting drug runners. And while drug trafficking, for example, in New Mexico's Boot Heel region is an issue, some of the narrative misses the point, which is that most, if not all, of the hard drugs that get into this country, meth, heroin, cocaine, come through ports of entry. It is a very orderly, illegal commerce. Yep. It is not, people making a run for the border at all times of the day and night. So, again, countering that narrative that to many border business leaders and border residents that feels false, I think it's just a constant battle.
Yeah, his speech here being in El Paso, wasn't as bad as the one in Nogales. The one in Nogales was the one that famously had the word filth in it, describing people coming across the border. And he took that out. It was in his written copy, but even what he left in described a war zone. That was the word he used, was war zone. When he came here, he described El Paso as a sliver of land upon which we build our beachhead. Well, no, you don't. You want to go to war with somebody, do it in Alabama, do it in your community. Don't come here and start talking about some stupid war because you want to fulfill the president's campaign promises. I mean,
That type of rhetoric, though, how does that play on the Mexican side of the border? Because doesn't the United States count on a solid relationship with Mexico when it comes to border security?
I think the short answer to your question is not well. You have a couple of dynamics. One, the peso has dropped precipitously, in part due to things that President, at the time campaigning President Trump said on the campaign trail, and you just saw the peso take a nosedive, and that makes things here much more expensive, so you don't see that kind of crossing. The other thing that I've seen in reports is that middle-class Mexicans who have the ability to travel anywhere in the world that they want, they can get visas, they're at a higher level, they are choosing not to come to the United States because why should they if they feel like A, they're not welcome, or B, why should they spend their money here if they could spend it better in Canada or in Europe? And I think that that's a trend that you're going to see, and we're going to feel it on the border. We're going to feel it in Mesilla, where most of the folks that go to Mesilla on the weekend are from El Paso or from Juarez, and you're just not, I think we're going to see an economic impact based on that.
and that's not even getting into the whole issue of the wall.
Yeah, didn't even mention the wall.
Well, so let's talk briefly about the wall. Obviously, it's tied into a possible federal shutdown. As we're taping this on Tuesday, there is the possibility of the government shutting down this weekend, and the wall has something to do with that. Right now, I mean, what are we seeing the possibility of that really having an issue, or is the White House walking that back right now?
Well, the White House, I think, is walking that back a little bit. It seemed like the administration was telegraphing that it would accept a spending bill without the wall in it. That being said, it continues to be the major thorn in the side of U.S.-Mexico relations at all levels.
Yeah, that's right. And coincidentally, that's coming up right on the president's 100-year, I don't want to say anniversary. I don't think 100 years is anything, but it is happening at the same time. And so it just, I think Lauren is right. I think all of the signals are he's not going to allow the government to shut down over this. They'll call it security, border security. They'll say that they're getting, I don't know, they'll find a way to save face, but I don't think they're going to let the government shut down.
I think the Wall Street Journal recently reported that border Congress people, Republican and Democrat, have united against money to fund a so-called wall. I think that it's sort of time that border leaders from both sides of the aisle talk about honestly what is needed for border security. I don't think anyone's denying that there are problems at the border and that there are drug problems, there are problems with illegal immigration, but a concrete wall, most people down here who live down here, conservative and progressive alike, believe that a wall isn't going to do anything to stop either of those trends.
All right. Well, I definitely want to thank you both for being here on New Mexico Now. Thank you to Walt Rubel with the Las Cruces Sun News and Lauren Villagran with the Albuquerque Journal. Remember, you can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at KRWG for the latest news and programming announcements. And we would love to hear your story ideas and topics for this program and others. All you have to do is email us at feedback@nmsu.edu. Thanks for joining us for New Mexico Now. I'm Anthony Moreno.